Ukraine's capital, Kiev, has come under renewed attack as Russia ramps up its invasion, now in its second day. Air raid sirens have sounded in Kiev this morning and blasts were heard in the hours before dawn. An apartment building was partially destroyed after Ukrainian forces said they downed a Russian fighter jet over the capital. Sirens have also been heard in the city of Lviv in western Ukraine. The Ukrainian government says at least 137 people have been killed and hundreds wounded across the country. Russia is continuing its air, sea and land assaults, which it launched in the early hours of Thursday morning. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says the fate of Europe is being decided in his country.
Ukrainian soldiers on the outskirts of the eastern city of Kyiv, inspecting just some of the carnage from day one of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Then, after dusk, the destruction continued. In Kyiv, civilians took refuge in subway stations, looking for whatever safety they could find. Also in the Ukraine capital, Kyiv, people headed for the underground, fearful Russia could launch airstrikes.
I'm here because I think it's one of the only places right now where you can hide in Kiev. All the other places are terrifying.
At a strategic airbase just 20 kilometers away from the capital, reports of Russian forces in control. However, Ukraine says it prevented a complete takeover of the facility. Ukrainian troops have set up roadblocks throughout the city's government quarter. Late on Thursday night, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said he was aware of the danger, but that he was remaining in the capital.
According to our information, the enemy has listed me as target number 1 and my family as target number 2. They want to destroy the country politically, terminating the head of state.
Satellite images also show the destruction Russia is raining down on Ukraine. Here, the damage to airfields in the east of the country. And Russia is proving it's not only interested in military facilities. Ukrainian officials confirmed they've lost control of the decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The scene of the world's worst nuclear disaster is now in Russian hands.
DW correspondent Matthias Berlinger joins me from Kiev. Matthias, city residents have been spending the night in air raid shelters. There are reports of explosions in the capital. What is the situation there right now?
Yeah, people are coming slowly out of these shelters now, but as you can see, there are few people on the streets. Many people have left the capital. We've seen these pictures of long columns of cars leaving the city. There was intense bombing last night. American intelligence says that Russia fired 160 rockets on Ukraine and part of them on the capital. There was also air defense destroying some of them. We are not sure right now what exactly happened, but there were clashes in the air when air defense hit something and the debris fell down and hit one residential building. People had been evacuated from there, but the building was burning and we don't really know about casualties yet. So the whole night there were attacks on the capital, and today there is the expectation that Russia will try to move with tanks onto the capital again.
Can you give me an idea of the mood among Ukrainians? The family members I've spoken to are staying. Many have been fleeing, and others want to fight.
Well, it's terror. People are afraid of what's going to happen next, and they're trying to do their best to protect themselves if they don't enlist in the forces. We've also seen pictures of people queuing up in front of the recruitment bureaus of the territorial defense forces. That's the volunteer battalions that are supposed to act behind the lines in support of the army, and we know that they have been mobilized also.
There are numerous reports that suggest Russia could enter the capital, even in the coming hours. They've already taken control, as we mentioned, of the Chernobyl area, around 150 kilometers to the north. Will they be met with resistance?
The Ukrainian government expects them to come from two sides, northwest and northeast, and has announced fierce resistance. What we've seen so far is that the Ukrainian army has been countering this attack quite forcefully. They are much the Russian army is, of course, in terms of technology, numbers and everything, much superior to the Ukrainian, but the motivation to defend the country is there, and we've seen these battles around the airfield that we've had mentioned before, where Russia was able to almost take control of it, and then it seems to have been, according to our information that we have now, have been completely driven out again. So there is, of course, a desire to defend the country, and these weapons that Ukraine has received, the javelins and the stingers, of course, they will be put to use.
Matthias, what about the situation in the east, which has been so key to the fighting over the past 8 years? Describe what you saw on your journey after returning from the east to the capital.
Well, we left pretty early we left the east pretty early, so we didn't witness any of the fighting there. There were a bomb yesterday morning. There were rocket artillery attacks, but we didn't see them. What we know now is that fighting has intensified along the line of contact with these self-proclaimed republics, and also the city of Kharkiv, which is not part of the Donbas, that part of the east that Ukraine has, and the separatists backed by Russia have been fighting about for years. But another region closer to Russia, this has also been under attack. So attacks on Ukraine are happening from all sides and from the south as well. So we have reports of heavy fighting everywhere.
Matthias Böhlinger in Kiev, thank you very much and stay safe. Well, we can go now to our Russian affairs analyst, Konstantin Egert. He's on the line from Vilnius. The world is looking on in disbelief at these events in Ukraine. What's your assessment of Russia's standing in the world, considering what's going on?
Not such a good morning, Ben, and I hope your relatives in Ukraine are safe. I think that, in fact, these pictures that we've seen in the last 24 hours are a PR disaster for the Kremlin. I don't think that even during the Yugoslav wars of 1990, we've seen anything like that. A major European city of nearly 3 million, but across a major European country, 44 million population, the largest European country wholly situated in Europe. So I suppose also there is a very clear, PR implication and all that, if I may sound cynical, and that is that Ukraine wasn't taken in one blow. We don't see, flowers and flags that basically it seems like the Kremlin expected to see. The resistance is stiff. Matthias has noted in the previous report from Kiev that this is, of course, a very unequal competition between the Ukrainian and Russian army. But on the other hand, defenders always have an advantage. And motivation, of course, is quite high among the Ukrainian forces. I cannot even imagine what will happen if and when the Russian forces enter major Ukrainian cities. We've seen what happened in Chechnya, in Grozny, in the North Caucasus in Russia in the 1990s. We've seen that Aleppo held out in Syria for about a year against an Air Force onslaught. I wonder what will happen in Kyiv. Again, I think it is already a PR disaster for Moscow.
And if they do manage to enter Kiev, how quickly could the government there fall?
Well, it seems that the fall of the government is not on the cards, because I do think that in such circumstances, I cannot penetrate the thinking of the Ukrainian government, but I would be quite surprised if they didn't make any kind of arrangements for the government to continue to operate from other parts of Ukraine, probably from Western Ukraine. And actually, what I think is a possibility is that the Russian forces could strike at Western Ukraine. It seems quite unimaginable now, also because it borders NATO, it borders Poland, and also because there's a fierce kind of anti-Moscow feeling there. But I suppose that the Ukrainian government thought about it. I do not think that taking Kiev as such, or Kyiv as the Ukrainians will call it, will mean the collapse of the Ukrainian state. I do think that there was a provision made for that. And everything we've seen in the last 24 hours show that the structures of the state are still there.
Well, apart from invading, I mean, the Russians would need to occupy some of the country for some time to keep any sort of puppet government in place, if that's what the intention is. I mean, we saw that with Yanukovych, of course. He was driven out by the Ukrainians.
Well, look, I think my military service is limited to 3 years, and I'm a first lieutenant reserve, so I can't pretend to be a military expert. But frankly speaking, I think that occupation force for a country of such size and such population needs to be really huge. Russian army, I think, standing Russian army is about 1 million people. Probably you will need most of it to take over Ukraine and maintain permanent occupation. Well, Vladimir Putin said he doesn't intend to occupy Ukraine, but then what's the point? I suppose that keeping the puppet government, well, you can keep it probably in one place. You can probably control Kiev, but it will be very difficult to imagine how this government will project its authority across the country, where I'm certain there's going to be a guerrilla war. So I think it's nearly mission impossible.
That said, how are Russians viewing this invasion?
Well, I think that what I've seen last night and all through the last day surprised me. I thought there's going to be much fewer protesters in Russia against the war. What I've seen actually in my native city of Moscow is quite impressive. Okay, it's a country of 140 million people, so I mean, it's not probably such a huge size, but one has to understand, people fear, people are apathetic in Russia. So those who went to the streets are very, very brave people. And I think the current figure is about 1,600 arrests. But looking into the future, what I can say, this war cannot be popular. And each day that it continues will sap support for this adventure. Whether it will eventually turn into some kind of elite pulling out between themselves or mass demonstrations, I don't know, but it will probably take time. But I'm sure it's not popular.
And as we heard from Konstantin there have been protests both in Russia and in Ukraine. Konstantin Egger, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Well, European Union leaders have agreed to impose new sanctions on Russia over its war on Ukraine, but they held back from cutting Russia from the global SWIFT payment system after resistance from some countries. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the agreed measures would have a major impact on Russia's economy.
We will hold the Kremlin accountable. The package of massive and targeted sanctions European leaders approved tonight clearly demonstrates that. It will have maximum impact on the Russian economy and the political elite, and it is built of 5 pillars. The first is the financial sector. Second, the energy sector. The third is the transport sector. Fourth are export controls and the ban of export financing. And finally, visa policy.
Christine Mahunbra is in Brussels for us to talk about the sanctions. Another round. How far do they go, though, this time?
Ben, the European Council President Charles Michel said that these sanctions were massive and painful, and by all indications, they will be, Ben. They will be felt by ordinary Russians as prices go up because of inflation, ordinary household items going up in prices. We can also expect, Ben, that some businesses will not survive as the economy goes into recession because of these sanctions. Beyond the sort of medium-term impact, this is also going to effectively destroy some industries in Russia as they're not able to access certain technologies that are required to power a modern-day future. So it is certainly looking like these sanctions will have an impact in the medium term, but also in the longer term, Ben.
Christine, we've had a whole raft of sanctions now, a whole series of them, from weak to strong and now massive, but the harshest of them all would be cutting Russia off from the interbanking system called SWIFT. But we're hearing that Germany and Italy held off on that. Why?
That's right. Ben, you've got to understand that for all the sanctions that are going to be imposed on the Russian economy, they're also going to hit European economies too, and some more than others. For Berlin and Rome, perhaps there is self-interest at play here. For Germany, it is, of course, that dependence on Russian gas. Germany is a major Russian gas importer. For Italy, it's those increasing business ties between Italy and Russia. The SWIFT payment system is a messaging system between banks, Ben, and cutting Russia off of that would effectively make it impossible to send money to Russia and out of Russia. And of course, that makes doing business with Russia difficult. Germany and Italy have been accused of pursuing self-interest at a time where, you know, lives are at risk. In fact, the Ukrainian foreign minister, hours before that meeting, anticipating that this would happen, said that anybody who wouldn't vote to ban Russia from SWIFT effectively had the blood of Ukrainians on their hands. But there is also another argument to this, Ben, and that is that you've got to keep some leverage because if this goes into some kind of a protracted war, you've got to be able to have some leverage to go to Moscow and put something on the table for. So that as well is a factor that European leaders did consider.
I understand the argument on leverage. I don't want to talk more about the business reasons behind this, but I mean, why hold back when Russia really isn't? I mean, that's the strategy of Putin's to go in and not hold back. I mean, watching Europe holding back here is really unsettling, I have to say. But before I go on a rant, let me just play to you something the Ukrainian president said. Listen into this.
In all the many conversations I've had with other leaders today, I've heard several things. The first one is that we're supported, and I'm grateful to every nation that helps Ukraine in concrete ways. But there is a second thing. We are alone in defending our nation. Who is ready to fight with us? I don't see anybody. Who is ready to give Ukraine a guarantee of joining NATO? Everyone is afraid.
A very good question. Let me pose that one to you, Christine. Is Ukraine alone in this fight against Russia?
We have to say, yes, Ben, that is the reality. When the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg briefed the press yesterday, he confirmed that there were no combat troops, NATO combat troops in Ukraine, and that there were no plans to send any to Ukraine. So this is certainly a fight the Ukrainians are going to have to take on their own. We know that NATO is making plans. It has warships and battleships on high alert. It's given special powers to its top commander. He can effectively deploy NATO's response force without having to go through the procedure of consulting all the 30 allies. But these provisions, Ben, have only been made for NATO member states and not for Ukraine. For Ukraine, it is the promise of more political support, more military aid going over to Ukraine. And indeed, we have seen some initiation by some member states opting to send more military aid as well as financial donations to help the Ukrainian army. But Ukrainian soldiers will not be fighting alongside Western soldiers in this fight. This will be their own fight, Ben.
Christine Melbourne for us, our Brussels correspondent. Great to have you on the show as well. US President Joe Biden has also moved to punish Russia with fresh sanctions, saying he's convinced Putin wants to overthrow Ukraine's democratically elected government in a premeditated attack. Biden has ruled out military intervention in Ukraine, but he did affirm the US commitment to defending its NATO allies in Eastern Europe.
And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased by from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure.
And let's bring in our correspondent in Washington, Stephen Simons. Stephen, we heard President Biden talk about Russia having to pay dearly for its aggression against Ukraine. For President Zelenskyy, the sanctions are not going far enough. And as we heard, Germany and Italy have their business interests to think about. Could the US have done more?
Well, I think you heard a president actually who was trying to exert leadership here and who was kind of also desperate to keep the House of the West together. Unity is a key word here, you know. If you leverage sanctions against Russia now, you need to do this unified. And as soon as this unity shows cracks, you'll have a problem. And I think the U.S. administration, U.S. diplomats, as well as I think European governments realize that. So the president tried to exert leadership here. Speaking of the sanctions and the SWIFT program, you know, it's fairly easy for Russia to get around the SWIFT program. So the president actually alluded to this because the Americans say they had actually told all of the allies and partners that, and also told and foreseen what will happen, that Russia will go for a big grab on Ukraine, not just the Donbass region. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that's at least what they claim. So, but could have been done more to save Ukraine? I don't know. Probably not. There's a lot of experts out there, a lot of people a lot smarter than I am who say and who have good reasons, good arguments for saying like this was inevitable and they couldn't have done anything more. Sanctions leveraged now against Russia, they are not preventing anything anymore. They are punishment and they are leverage for future possible negotiations, I think.
Okay, yes, Stephen, we're just looking at live pictures of Ukraine and the situation right now, which is a very sad situation, a bombed-out building there. The US has ruled out military intervention in Ukraine, but what more can it offer in order to support the country?
Yeah, troops on the ground or boots on the ground, definitely not, because Ukraine is not a NATO member. And of course, the United States wants to avoid, and that is expressis verbis also the president saying, as well as everybody else in his administration, that the U.S. does not want a war or a confrontation, soldier against soldier, with the Russians. The belief is here also that the Russians don't want that either and actually are a little bit afraid of that's going to happen. So, but you have a horrible situation in Ukraine and there is really no clue offered by anybody what the U.S. can do actually to actively help the Ukraine now. Definitely not militarily. More weapons, to get more weapons or weaponry or weapon systems into the Ukraine right now seems a little bit iffy at best. I mean, if not even impossible. So moral support and maybe an increase in or a leveraging of more severe sanctions peu à peu, step by step, in the next coming days. But
the US is sending over more troops to neighbouring NATO members. We know that. How is the American public feeling about that?
Yeah, we know that the Americans sent 7,000 troops to Germany, and from there they will be sent to other nations to the eastern border of NATO, so to speak. I can't tell you how Americans feel about this because it's a little bit too early. That was yesterday that the president said that. I know, though, that the American public now pays attention to what's going on in Ukraine, but that's not necessarily because the United States says they're sending 7,000 troops. That's because the president said that every American will feel the pain, and that means at the gas station. The sticker shock is coming to America, and of course Mr. Biden realizes that this is not something which helps him politically and in the eyes of the American people.
Stephen Simons, thank you very much for the analysis from Washington.